Well, good afternoon. Thanks so much for inviting me to be with you again at Rancho Mirage in this great conclave of readers and writers. This morning I talked about my current project, which is a trilogy about the American Revolution, but Jamie Kabler asked me if this afternoon I could scooch forward in time a bit as a way of acknowledging and honoring a different war in a different century. I spent 15 years writing a trilogy about the American role in the liberation of Europe during World War II, and since 2025 will mark the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, of that stupendous earthquake, I'm grateful for the chance to talk about it. Because World War II was not only the most consequential event in the world during the 20th century, but it's also an event that continues to reverberate with repercussions in America in 2025. Of the 16,112,566 Americans who served in uniform in World War II, there are about 100,000 still alive. They're dying at the rate of more than 100 every day. The median age is 98, and by 2034 there will be fewer than 1,000 World War II veterans still alive in this country. So this is an excellent time to remember all who served, to acknowledge our debt to them, and to recall what they show us about our national fortitude. The novelist John Updike called World War II the 20th century's central myth. He called it a vast imagining of a primal time when good and evil contended for the planet, a tale of Troy, whose angles are infinite and whose central figures never fail to amaze us with their size, their theatricality, their sweep. The war lasted 2,174 days, and by the end it had become the greatest catastrophe in human history. 60 million dead. That's 27,600 dead every day for 6 years, 1,150 dead an hour. If you were a German boy born between 1915 and 1924, the odds were 1 in 3 that by 1945 you would be dead. 60 million dead in 6 years means a death every 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. That's World War II. George C. Marshall, who was the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, called it a great and terrible epoch. And new words would be required to describe it, words like genocide and superpower, which is a neologism that was coined in 1944. And old words assume new usages, words like Holocaust. This war waged across 6 continents on those titanic 3-syllable battlefields that still serve as historical mileposts: Stalingrad, Tarawa, Anzio, Normandy, as well as in improbable settings rarely associated with the Second World War. Places like the Aleutians, Madagascar, Syria, Darwin, Australia. A good library, like this one certainly is, can serve as a time machine, transporting us to distant eras and faraway places. And we'll use this place, this setting, to do just that this afternoon. W.G. Sebald was an elegant German writer who was born in Bavaria in 1944. And before he died in England in a car wreck in December 2001, he wrote, "We have appointments to keep in the past, in what has gone before and is for the most part extinguished. And we must go there in search of places and people who have some connection with us from the far side of time." Well, toward that end, I'd like to keep another appointment in the past. More than 80 years ago, on the morning of May 15th, 1944, at St. Paul's School on Hammersmith Road in London, it's a Gothic building of red brick and terracotta, where on that morning, Winston Churchill, George Patton, Omar Bradley, Bernard Montgomery, King George VI, and several dozen other British and American commanders gathered to review the final secret plan for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. They met in an auditorium known as the Model Room, not nearly as nice as this one, sitting on 9 rows of hard wooden benches normally used by schoolboys. The poet John Milton had been a student at St. Paul's, among other English luminaries. Even in mid-May, it was cold as a meat locker in the model room because German bombs had broken all 700 windows at St. Paul's, and many of the generals and admirals were bundled up in their overcoats. On the floor of the cockpit of the auditorium, there was an enormous plaster relief map of the Normandy coast where the River Seine spills into the Atlantic at a scale of 6 inches to the mile. And as the plan was reviewed, a British brigadier wearing no-skid socks shuffled across this floor map with a pointer to indicate various locations on what in 3 weeks would become the most famous battlefield in the world. The beaches, for instance: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. And towns like St. Lo, Cherbourg, Caen. The man running that conference is someone you've heard of. You see his name around this town frequently: Dwight David Eisenhower. The late spring of 1944, he's 53 years old. He's smoking 4 packs of Camels a day. His blood pressure is 176 over 110. That's stage 2 hypertensive. He's a 4-star general at the time of Normandy, but he's still in ascent. He's rocketing from lieutenant colonel to 5-star in 42 months. It's an average of 6 months between promotions. President Roosevelt has selected him as the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force because he is, as the president says, a, quote, natural leader with exceptional political instincts. He has a knack for getting along with the British, notwithstanding the Anglophobia that infests senior Army ranks in the American Army. Unlike most of his U.S. Army peers, he likes the British. He's adopted words like petrol and tiffin. It drives Patton insane. He's also been chosen because he's got exceptional organizational gifts. He describes himself as chairman of the board. That's the corporate metaphor he uses. Chairman of the largest martial enterprise in the Western world. The immediate task at hand as they gather that morning in May is to catapult an army across that ugly piece of water called the English Channel, which is how the official U.S. Army history describes it. That alone was among the most complex undertakings in the history of warfare. The channel is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest, but for nearly 1,000 years, invading armies facing a hostile shore across the English Channel had found as much grief as glory. The U.S. War Department had even pondered tunneling beneath the seabed to France. A detailed study deemed the project feasible, requiring 1 year and 15,000 miners to excavate 55,000 tons of spoil. Wiser heads questioned, quote, the strategic and functional complexities of that plan, such as the inconvenience of the entire German 7th Army waiting for the first miner's head to pop out of the tunnel. The study was shelved. Eisenhower and his comrades had so many worries in Operation Overlord that they had their own acronym, PINWE, Problems of the Invasion of Northwest Europe. For example, there was anxiety that German planes would drop rats infected with bubonic plague over London, and authorities in London offered bounties for rat carcasses to test for plague. There was anxiety that German aircraft would disperse what were called radioactive poisons over England, and Geiger counters were stockpiled to test for radioactivity. And of course, there was anxiety that Hitler would initiate chemical warfare with mustard gas, phosgene, and other toxins. The Allies stockpiled 160,000 tons of chemical munitions for retaliatory use in Europe and the Mediterranean. Planners had drafted, with Eisenhower's approval, 2 secret target lists for chemical warfare in Normandy. One list tried to minimize French civilian casualties by hitting German troop concentrations, transportation targets, and bridges. The other list ignored potential French casualties. It included dozens of communication centers in northwest France, including many, many post offices. French losses would have been even more enormous than they were from conventional bombs, artillery, and bullets. Now, similar combat efforts obviously were underway in the Pacific, and even though this afternoon I'm talking mainly about the United States, let's acknowledge that when we talk about American dominance in the war, we ought not suggest that the United States was the preeminent killing power. Soviet forces killed roughly 9 times more German soldiers than Britain and the US combined. The Red Army suffered more casualties at Stalingrad alone in late 1942 than the US armed forces sustained in the entire war. Of a Soviet population of 190 million, 14% perished. Of the American population of 130 million, about 1/3 of 1% perished. Now, the United States had become among the last of the large powers to be drawn into this conflagration, but very quickly, the war encumbered all of America. When the war began in earnest on September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland, the United States Army, still at peace, was a puny weakling. By one measure, it ranked 17th among armies of the world in size and combat power, right behind that perennial military powerhouse, Romania. The U.S. Army in 1939 comprised 190,000 soldiers. It would grow to 8.3 million in 1945. It's a 44-fold increase. I mentioned that more than 16 million Americans served in uniform, again in a country of 130 million. Virtually every family had someone they loved in harm's way. Virtually every American had an emotional investment in our military. Virtually everyone had skin in the game. Fighting a world war required manpower, lots of manpower. By 1944, 11,000 young men were being drafted into the Army and Navy every day. It's a rate of 4 million a year. 1 in 3 GIs had only a grade school education. Slightly more than 1 in 10 had at least a semester of college. A private, by the way, earned $50 a month, although if he was awarded the Medal of Honor and survived the experience, he got an extra $2 in his paycheck. The typical soldier was 5 feet 8 inches tall. He weighed 144 pounds, but the Depression had been very hard on our nation's health. The desperate need for bodies in uniform, especially infantrymen, to go to places like Normandy, led to the drafting of what were known as physically imperfect men. I know some women consider that phrase redundant. Oh, boo. Yeah. Standards had been lowered to accept defects that would have kept some men out of uniform earlier in the war. For example, draftees at one time had to have at least 12 of their natural 32 teeth. By 1944, how many teeth did you have to be drafted into the United States Army? 0. And that's because the Army and the Navy had drafted 1/3 of all the dentists, civilian dentists in the US. Collectively, they extracted 15 million teeth. They filled 68 million more. They made 2.5 million sets of dentures, all enabling each GI to be able to masticate the Army ration. Sounds like an obscene act, but that was the standard. By 1944, a man could be drafted with 2400 vision if correctable to 20/40 in one eye. The armed forces made 2.3 million pairs of eyeglasses during the war. The old joke had come true that the Army didn't examine eyes, it just counted them. In fact, you could be drafted with only one eye. You could be drafted if you were completely deaf in one ear, if you'd lost both of your external ears. Or you could be drafted if you were missing a thumb or 3 fingers on one hand, including your trigger finger. Venereal disease had kept many men out of the uniform early in the war, but that restriction also was lifted, and the Army soon was drafting 12,000 men a month with VD, most of them syphilitic. How could they do that? Penicillin. The extraordinary discovery by British scientists of the antibiotic agent in the 1920s was followed by a massive effort by the Americans and British to take a substance that had been made by the gram and to make it by the kilogram and eventually by the ton. Mental and personality standards for service in the armed forces had also been loosened. In April 1944, the War Department decreed that draftees need have only, quote, a reasonable chance of adjusting to military life. Although psychiatric examiners at draft boards were advised to watch for 24 personality deviations, including silly laughter, sulkiness, resentfulness of discipline, and other traits that would seemingly disqualify every teenager in the United States. Why these extreme measures to fill the ranks? Because of the crying need for soldiers, especially infantrymen, especially riflemen. Even in a country of 130 million, we were running out. The Brits did run out. The war remained brutal and voracious to the very end. In April 1945, the last full month of the war in Europe, almost 11,000 American soldiers were killed in action in Germany, nearly as many as had died and been killed in June 1944, the month of invasion. It was awful to the last gunshot. The war cost U.S. taxpayers $296 billion. That's $4 trillion in today's currency. To help underwrite a military budget that increased 8,000%, President Roosevelt expanded the number of taxpayers in this country from 4 million to 42 million. Which takes us back to the spring of 1944. When that conference occurs at St. Paul's School on May 15th, American soldiers by the tens of thousands are pouring into Britain every week. Since January, the number of GIs there had doubled to 1.5 million. It's a country the size of Oregon. Of the U.S. Army's 89 divisions, 20 now could be found in the United Kingdom, with 37 more earmarked for the European theater or actually en route to Britain. They came through Liverpool, through Swansea, Cardiff, Belfast, but most came into Glasgow and adjacent Greenock, more than 100,000 in April 1944 alone. 15,000 at a time arrived on each of the two Queens, Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary, ships that could haul an entire division apiece and outrun German U-boats to make the crossing from New York in 5 days. We can see them, can't we? Down the gangplank they come. They tromp, names checked from a clipboard, each soldier wearing his helmet, his field jacket, and a large celluloid button color-coded by the section of the ship to which he had been confined during the passage. Troops carry 4 blankets apiece to save cargo space. Deluded officers can be seen lugging folding chairs, pillowcases, tennis rackets. A brass band and Highland pipers greet them on the dock. Scottish children raise their arms in a V for victory. Combat pilots who have fulfilled their mission quotas and are waiting to board the ship for the return voyage bellow, "Go back before it's too late," or "What's your wife's telephone number?" Each arriving unit is listed in a master log called the Iron Book, and another manifest called the Forecast of Destination shows where every company would bivouac momentarily in Britain. Then they fall in, 4 abreast, and march from the dock to nearby troop trains to be hauled to 1,200 camps and 133 airfields across the British Isles. GIs called this new land Spamland, but the prevailing odor came from burning feces in coal-fired incinerators operated by the U.S. Army School of Hygiene. The loading of invasion vessels bound for the far shore. That's what they called Normandy, since almost no one knew where they were actually going. That loading had begun on May 4th, 1944, and it intensified as the month wore away. 7,000 kinds of combat necessities had to reach the Norman beaches in the first 4 hours, from surgical scissors to bazooka rockets, followed by tens of thousands of tons in the days following. Responsibility for embarkation fell to 3 military bureaucracies with acronyms evocative of the Marx Brothers: MOVCO, Turco, and Embarco. In 22 British ports, stevedores slung pallets and cargo nets into holds and onto decks, loading radios from Pennsylvania, grease from Texas, rifles from Massachusetts. Again, we can see it, can't we? Day after night after day, war material cascading onto the wharves and quays, a catalog Homeric in magnitude and variety, radio crystals by the thousands, carrier pigeons by the hundreds, 100 silver stars and 300 Purple Hearts. Soldiers called the Purple Heart the German Marksmanship Medal, for every American Major General to award as warranted. Also, 600,000 doses of penicillin, 50 tons of sulfa, and 800,000 pints of plasma meticulously segregated by black and white donors. A company that had been contracted to provide 10,000 metal crosses missed its deadline, and instead, graves registration units would improvise with wooden graves markers. Cotton mattress covers used as shrouds for the dead had been purchased on the basis of 1 for every 375 man days in France. That formula would prove far too optimistic. In July, with supplies of mattress covers, shrouds, dwindling, quartermasters would be forced to ship another 50,000. This is war on a very large scale, the largest scale, and it's only the beginning. In the European theater alone, the American prodigy of organization, that was Churchill's term, would ship 18 million tons of war stuff. That kit ranged from 800,000 military vehicles to footwear in sizes 2A to 22 EEE. By 1945, the United States had built 2/3 of all ships afloat worldwide and was making half of all manufactured goods worldwide. World war is a clash of systems. Which system can generate the combat power to prevail, whether it's in the form of 12,000 Allied airplanes aloft on D-Day, the 10-to-1 advantage in Allied ammunition, often enjoyed by the Allies, the mass production of penicillin and proximity fuses, the ability to design, build, deliver, and detonate an atomic bomb. Which system can produce and educate the men? And they were mostly men, which is why the war took so long, capable of organizing the shipping, the rail and truck transportation, the stupendous logistical demands of global war. It's often been argued that in a fair fight, mano a mano, when one American infantry battalion fought a German battalion, or a regiment fought a regiment, that the Germans were usually better. A fair fight? Who's looking for a fair fight? Germany, despite an undeniable genius for tactical and operational warfare, could not muster the wherewithal to cross the English Channel, 21 miles wide, to invade Britain. The US projected power across the Pacific, the Atlantic, into the Mediterranean, Southeast Asia, the seven seas, the infinite skies. Adaptability, versatility, ingenuity, preponderance, raw power. These are the salient characteristics of the US military in World War II. The enemy was crushed by logistical brilliance, firepower, mobility, mechanical aptitude, and an economic juggernaut that produced much, much more of nearly everything than Germany and the other Axis powers could produce. Bombers, bombs, fighters, transport planes, mortars, machine guns, trucks. It's a long list. Yet the war absorbed only 1/3 of the American gross domestic product. It's a smaller proportion than that of any major belligerent. A German prisoner complained, "Warfare like yours is easy." But of course, there was nothing easy about it. How, nearly 8 decades after the shooting stopped in World War II do we assess the consequences? Well, the legacy of the war is as profound as the sacrifices that built that legacy. First, of course, Allied victory strangled the sinister ambitions of fascist regimes in Germany, Japan, and Italy. It also brought to an end the British and French empires. It politically fractured both a continent, Europe, and individual countries, such as Korea, Vietnam, Germany. It led to the creation of both the United Nations and NATO, and it yielded a bipolar world, part Soviet, part American, that persisted for half a century. A war that was fundamentally about liberty spawned independence movements and colonial wars that led to the creation of modern India, Pakistan, Ghana, Kenya, Israel, and other states in a fermentation that obviously continues to this day. We Americans emerged from World War II with extraordinary advantages that ensured prosperity for decades, an intact, thriving industrial base, a population relatively unscarred by war, cheap energy, 2/3 of the world's gold supply, great optimism. As the major power in Western Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific, possessing atomic weapons and a navy and an air force of unequaled might, the United States was ready to exploit what the historian H.P. Wilmot described as, quote, the end of the period of European supremacy in the world that had existed for 4 centuries. The war largely dispelled American isolationism, and please don't let it come back, even as it encouraged American exceptionalism, as well as a penchant for military solutions, and a self-regard that caused some to label our epoch the American century. Remember what John Adams told us, power always thinks it has a great soul. The war was a potent catalyst for social change across the Republic. New technologies, jets, computers, ballistic missiles, mass production of houses, soon spawned vibrant new industries, which in turn encouraged the migration of black workers from south to north, and of all peoples to the emerging West. The GI Bill put millions of soldiers into college classrooms, spurring unprecedented social mobility. World War II was perhaps the greatest agent of social change in this country during the 20th century. Our national evolution on core issues of racial and gender equality are very much shaped by the war. What did it cost besides $296 billion? Well, 13 US divisions in Europe suffered at least 100% casualties. 5 more exceeded 200%. From all theaters, American service casualties in the war included 1,700 left blind, 11,000 with at least partial paralysis of one or more limbs, and 18,000 amputations. Aggregate numbers illuminate how unspeakably inhuman the war was. Teasing out the deaths one at a time affirms our humanity. As we consider these big arrows on the map and contemplate the greatest self-inflicted catastrophe in human history, 60 million dead, it's proper to bear in mind the miraculous singularity of death. Each of those deaths was as unique as a fingerprint or a snowflake. Patricia O'Malley was a year old when her father, Major Richard James O'Malley, a battalion commander in the 12th Infantry Regiment, was killed by a sniper in Normandy. After seeing his headstone for the first time in the cemetery above Omaha Beach, she wrote, "I cried for the joy of being there and the sadness of my father's death. I cried for all the times I needed a father and never had one. I cried for all the words I'd wanted to say and wanted to hear, but had not. I cried and cried." The Australian war correspondent Osmer White, who bore witness both in the Pacific and with Patton's Third Army in Europe, later wrote, "The living have the cause of the dead in trust. We, the living, 337 million strong in America today, have the cause of the dead in trust. About 400,000 Americans died during the war, including 291,000 killed in action. After the war ended, there were 353 temporary American military cemeteries scattered around the globe. In 1947, the next of kin of all American troops who had been buried overseas, and that was nearly all who died in Europe and the Pacific and whose bodies were recovered, those next of kin filled out Quartermaster Form 345. It was a one-time option offered by the U.S. government whether to have their sons, and they were mostly sons, brought home for permanent reburial, or to have them interred in one of more than a dozen American Battle Monuments Commission cemeteries abroad. Those cemeteries overseas were being built to consolidate all those smaller cemeteries. Almost 40% chose to leave their soldier overseas. 60% brought them home. It was at a cost of $564.50 for each disinterment, regardless of where that soldier was permanently buried. Each grave was opened by hand, and the remains of every dead soldier dusted with an embalming compound of formaldehyde, aluminum chloride, wood powder, clay, and plaster of Paris. Then they were placed in a metal casket with a satin pillow. Labor strikes in the United States had caused a shortage of casket steel, and repatriation was further delayed by a dearth of licensed embalmers. In warehouses in Cherbourg, Cardiff, and elsewhere, the dead accumulated. Finally, the SS Joseph V. Connolly, the first of 21 ghost ships from Europe and the Pacific, sailed from Antwerp with more than 5,000 soldiers in her hold. On October 27, 1947, the Connolly berthed in New York. Stevedores winched the caskets from the ship two at a time in specially designed slings, and a great diaspora began as these dead and those who followed traveled mostly by rail across the Republic for burial in their hometowns or in national cemeteries. That's how the dead came home. But what of their belongings? What of the things they carried? Even before the dead came home, these things had been coming back. At a large warehouse on Hardesty Avenue in Kansas City, the U.S. Army Effects Bureau had begun as a modest quartermaster enterprise with a half dozen employees in February 1942. That expanded to more than 1,000 workers, and by August 1945, they were handling 60,000 shipments a month, each laden with the effects of American dead from 6 continents. Hour after hour, day after day, shipping containers were unloaded from rail freight cars onto a receiving dock and then hoisted by elevator to the depot's 10th floor. And here the containers traveled by assembly line conveyor belt from station to station down to the 7th floor. Inspectors pawed through the crates to extract pornography, ammunition, perhaps amorous letters from a girlfriend that would further grieve a grieving widow. Workers used grinding stones and dentist drills to remove corrosion and blood from helmets and web gear. Laundresses took pains to scrub bloodstains out of field jackets and uniform shirts. A detailed inventory was then pinned to each repacked container before it was stacked in an enormous storage bin. And all the while, banks of typists in a huge adjacent room hammered out correspondence to the next of kin, up to 70,000 letters a month, the gist of which was this: Dear sir, dear madam, we have your dead son's stuff. Do you want it back? Where should we send it? Well, over the years, Effects Bureau inspectors found many amazing things: tapestries, enemy swords, a German machine gun, an Italian accordion, walrus tusks, shrunken head, a tobacco sack full of diamonds. Among thousands of diaries also collected in Kansas City was a small notebook that belonged to Lieutenant Herschel G. Horton, 29 years old, of Aurora, Illinois. Shot in the right leg and hip during a firefight with the Japanese in New Guinea, Horton had dragged himself into a grass shanty. And over the several days that it took for him to die, he had scribbled a final letter in the notebook. It began, "My dear, sweet father, mother, and sister, I lay here in this terrible place, wondering not why God has forsaken me, but why he is making me suffer. The first duty is to remember." Our recent poet laureate, Natasha Trethewey, ends her poem Pilgrimage, which is about a visit to the Civil War battlefield at Vicksburg, with these lines. "In my dream, the ghost of history lies down beside me, rolls over, pins me beneath a heavy arm." Let's not forget to feel that heavy arm. Thanks again for asking me to be with you here today. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We've got 9 minutes and counting for questions, and if you raise your hand, I'll repeat the question. Sir, over there in the blue sweater or jacket.
And they say the Germans guessed right and planned on Normandy and had all their resources, backup and otherwise there. Do you think it would have had an impact or just deferred the inevitable?
He asked if the Germans guessed right and figured the invasion in 1944 was coming to Normandy, would it have had an impact or just delayed the inevitable? Well, they didn't guess right. They guessed wrong. And they guessed wrong in part because of a brilliant deception campaign orchestrated largely by the British, who have a genius for deception. And they thought that the invasion was more likely to come at the Pas de Calais, which is the narrowest point between Britain and France. And so they kind of put their chips there. Instead, it came farther south in Normandy. Had they massed forces more appropriately and with greater vigor at Normandy, casualties would have been a lot higher. Eisenhower, who was always willing to take the blame, if blame needed to be apportioned, had written a private note and put it in his pocket, put it in his wallet, actually, as he had before previous invasions in North Africa and Sicily, the gist of which was, "Our landings have failed, the fault is entirely mine, I take full responsibility." That's character. He didn't have to release that note, obviously. If the invasion had failed, if the Germans had thrown the invasion forces back, and it was very close at Omaha Beach, there was a decision had to be made whether to take those forces that were under fire on Omaha Beach and were getting shot to pieces. If you've seen the Saving of Private Ryan, those first 22 minutes of that movie give you a pretty intense understanding of what heavy combat is like on the Norman beaches, and whether they need to be pulled off the beaches and shifted probably to Utah. That didn't have to happen. I think it would have delayed the war by a year. It would have meant Eisenhower almost certainly would have been relieved of command. Having lost that big battle, it's unlikely Roosevelt would have kept him there. George Marshall probably would have been appointed as the supreme commander. It could have delayed it for more than a year. Some think that it could have delayed it by 2 or 3 years, but that didn't happen. That's a counterfactual. Historians always love counterfactuals because you can never be wrong. Sir.
Question. Do you know how the split of lives and resources was between the Pacific Theater and the European Theater?
He asked about the split of lives and manpower between the Pacific Theater and the Atlantic Theater, and dollars, yeah. The decision was made very early on when the United States, after Pearl Harbor, the United States got into the war, that the effort by the Allied powers, particularly Britain and America, would focus on Germany first. That was the phrase, Germany first, because the presumption was that Germany was the strongest of the 3 major Axis powers, and that if you could kill the snake in Germany, the others would fall of their own weight. That was a sensible decision. It proves historically to have been the right decision. So I mentioned there were 89 American divisions. About more than 2/3 of them end up going to Europe. All 6 Marine divisions go to the Pacific. A preponderance, there was supposed to be a more or less even split of the United States Navy between the Atlantic and the Pacific. That didn't happen. Most of them ended up going to the Pacific. It was more of a naval war. The distances are so much greater. So most of the American Navy, but the Royal Navy and Commonwealth navies supporting the Royal Navy are mostly in the Atlantic. Casualties, most of the casualties are in Europe because the fighting is more intense there. Island hopping casualties are horrendous at places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, obviously, but they don't, cumulatively, they're not comparable to Europe. So, sir, right there.
I've heard, I've been to Normandy, as well as my wife, and I understand that all the land there that the Americans were buried in is actually owned by the United States, that portion.
Yeah.
I forgot about that when I was over there, but that's actually land of the United States of America.
Yeah, he said he's been to the cemetery above Omaha Beach, and some of you others have been there, sure, I'm sure. You know, I think technically it's not owned by the United States. I don't think it's sovereign territory, but I've been to a number of those American Battle Monuments Commission cemeteries, including the one near Tunis, the one near Anzio, others in Europe, Punch Bowl in the Pacific, and Oahu. The thing that's most striking about them is how meticulously maintained they are now, 70 years later, 80 years later. The host countries, including the Tunisians, the Italians, the French, there are none in Germany. The decision was made at the time of this repatriation in 1947. No dead American soldier would be buried in Germany. But the Belgians, they treat them like their own boys. The cemeteries are that beautifully maintained and celebrated on Memorial Day and so on. So they're in good hands. Sir?
So, you know, the end of the Second World War, you know, led to this unprecedented era of peace and growth and welfare around the world. And you mentioned that the veterans are now few in numbers, and maybe we're forgetting, but seems to be things falling apart. I wonder if you have reflections on.
He says things seem to be falling apart. Do I have reflection? I'm sorry, we're out of time. You know, we've been through tough times before. Times are tough now. I don't deny that. I'm appalled and worried. But you know, we've been through a civil war, 600,000 dead. We've been through World War II, World War I. We've been through the American Revolution, 8 years of a struggle for survival. We're going to get through this, but we're going to do it together, or it's not going to happen. That's my feeling about it. Okay, we got time for one more. Yes, sir.
Is there a particular historian that you looked up to or inspired you?
A particular historian that I looked up to or inspired me. Well, there's a lot of them. I stand on the shoulders of a lot of great ones. Not a World War II historian, but I really like Shelby Foote, somebody who wrote a 3-volume history of the Civil War. I go back and reread passages of it for inspiration. There are a lot of great World War II historians. My pal Sir Max Hastings, a British former journalist like I am, also a good friend, Sir Anthony Beevor. Anthony Beevor, former British Army officer, very fine historian. So I look for people that I can draw inspiration from as well as rely on for historical accuracy. They're going to cut off the mic. I thank you again for having me here. Thank you.